Hey, good morning to our colleagues from India and good evening to those who are attending from the US and other parts of the world. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our webinar, Weather Datasets for Power System Modeling in India. My name is Priya Sridharan, and I'm a Senior Program Director at GridLab, where I lead initiatives in the areas of resource adequacy and reliability, distribution system modernization, and open source modeling. Before coming to GridLab, I had the privilege of working with several of the webinar attendees on India power sector and clean energy issues. And on behalf of the entire panel, I wanted to express our gratitude for your interest in devoting your time for this event. Before we dive in, I would like to share just a little bit of background about GridLab. GridLab is a public interest organization that provides technical assistance with a heavy focus on reliability of the power system. We work across the bulk and distribution system. A significant part of our portfolio is devoted towards resource adequacy and how to think about reliability and resource adequacy in the context of the challenges that high penetration renewables bring. We are heavily devoted towards advancing the art and science of how we model the power system, including accessibility to robust tools and data sets that can aid this analysis. We primarily work in the US. However, this project was born out of recognizing that some of the modeling approaches we have been developing may be of value to other jurisdictions. GridLab is co-leading this effort with RMI and in collaboration with each of the panelists' organizations, including Tata Power, EPRI, or Electric Power Research Institute, Vaisala, and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, or NREL as they are known. Just very briefly, the agenda is as follows. We will have 1 hour of formal presentations. Dr. Pravir Sinha, who was the inspiration and catalyst for this effort, will provide opening comments. We will then move to a brief overview of this project before diving into the topic of weather and renewable datasets, beginning with an introduction, followed by presentations that describe these datasets and an overview of the web page where the datasets can be found. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Pravir Sinha, who is an inspiration to many of us in the sector. He is a CEO and managing director of Tata Power and a leader in the power sector industry for more than 4 decades. At this point, I invite Dr. Sinha to the floor and to please provide your perspectives on renewable development in India, the role of data sets and analytics, and on this particular initiative.
Thank you, Priya, and such a pleasure to be part of this discussion. Good morning, good evening, depending upon which part of the world you are. But it's unique effort that is being made by Priya from GridLab and also from the other partners, especially Sonika and Justin and others from NREL and EPRI. I've been involved in the power sector for many years, and I have been a student of what sort of weather data sets are used, especially in terms of power demand, and how do we do a much better projection of how the power quantum is required to be supplied on real-time basis. Considering that a lot of changes have happened in last year, I remember a few years back in Delhi, we used to have 43 generating plants who used to supply to Delhi. Now, of course, it is much larger because you have so many more of renewable projects which are there. These are typically solar and wind, and they have very different profiles of generation, unlike coal-based or gas-based or hydro, where there is much better predictability in terms of their generation. What we have also seen is that the quality of data sets in India are not very good, unlike other places in the world where there is much better quality of data sets and the way that the data is collected on a very, very micro siting basis. In India, it is on a very, very generic area basis, and it does not provide us the comfort of doing a better modeling than what is required. We have typically in last many years used different types of data sets from different agencies, starting from IMD. Quality of data is not there because they don't have so many weather stations. They don't put theolite. They don't put balloons to carry these theolites and do micro sighting of the data sets. We've used, in fact, IBM Deep Thunder and Blue Wave. We use SkyMet. We use AccuWeather. We use Windy. And we do, I would say, algorithm which considers each one of them depending upon the quality of data, and the weightage is given accordingly. We have of late been using Weather Expert, and we find that their quality of data is much better. Of course, not to the extent that we would require, because when we say that it is 10%, it does not mean that it is a 10% variation on the average through the day. You would have some slots in which it will be 40-50% variation in some. Also, one of the challenge that we are seeing is that the weather pattern is undergoing a huge change in the country. We have seen last year the summer was intense. Many parts of the country had 50 to 55-degree temperature, and for long periods of time. In fact, we had more than 50-degree temperature in nearly 3/4 of the country last year for more than 30 to 35 days. This year, the monsoon has been there and the demand has crashed. And how do you manage that? And also related to that is that the generation of renewable is much less compared to what it was last year. So how do we do a much better prediction? How do we calibrate it in such a way that we are able to optimize the usage of energy? Also, the challenge is that with more and more renewable penetration, whether it is the large utility or distributed generation through rooftop and other systems, do we have a much better understanding of how the flow of power takes place and what it does to impact the grid? So I think this study is phenomenal. We are all looking forward that this will give us certain directions in terms of prediction, as well as managing the grid in a much more stable manner with the harmonics and the reactive power and various other aspects which are impacting, because you have certain hours with excess and certain hours when you have real shortage of power. And the sudden change that takes place in the evening time and morning time when the renewable, the solar comes online. So I'm looking forward to this study, and I hope the work that is being done by GridLab along with EPRI, Vaisala, and NREL and RMI will give us a very good idea and direction of which way we need to go. So once again, thank you all for joining, and thank you to Priya for having me on this call.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sinha. Our next speaker is Sonika Chaudhary. Sonika, while I complete your introduction, I invite you to start sharing your screen. Sonika Chaudhary, who is my co-director of this effort, will provide a brief overview of the broad initiative. Sonika is a principal at RMI, where she leads strategy and initiatives on grid reliability, resource planning, and energy storage in India. She has over 15 years of experience in clean energy research, policy, and analysis, working with leading utilities and developers across India and the US. Sonika, you are welcome to begin.
Great. Thank you, Priya, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Dr. Sinha, for your inspiration on taking on this work. Hello, everyone. I'm Sonika, and I'm a principal with RMI India program. First of all, thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited for the release of our weather dataset, which we are doing today, and it's great to see all of your interest in this webinar. This release is part of our India Grid Study project, which is a joint effort with GridLab and RMI and our partners on this call, NREL, Tata Power, Vaisala, and EPRI. So before we begin, let me first set the context of why we are doing this work. And Dr. Sinha already walked over some of the background. But historically, in India and as well as around the world, power system planning was designed for a thermal dominated systems. And the questions and the reliability metrics were relatively simple, focusing around how much annual energy demand do we need, what is the summer peak, and using heuristics like load duration curve and planning reserve margins, which you can fit in an Excel model. But with today's growing share of renewables, this paradigm is shifting, as shown in this central figure on this chart here. And we are not only concerned about the peak demand or the gross demand, but in fact, the net demand. And as well as storage is already playing an increasing role right now with battery storage shifting energy within the day. And instead of planning for reliability around thermal unit outages, grid planners and operators now need to understand renewables variability, and that too across the day, seasons, and from year to year. And while several of new sophisticated planning tools are being currently adopted in India, a key foundation for them is this high quality, easily accessible data. And I'm hoping with our efforts with this data set release today, it is a step in this direction. And so with that broader context, let me now specifically talk more about this India Grid Study project. And as you know, India has already reached its 2030 goal, already 5 years early. It's a significant milestone, but the harder challenge lies ahead. How do we sustain this momentum and build confidence in the grid that could achieve up to 60 to 80% clean in the coming decades? And after that, how would this set up us for the net zero by 2070? So the study is designed to answer a few foundational questions. For example, low-risk solutions on resources choices to reaching these 60 to 80% clean grid goals by 2040. And what are the reliability trade-offs between them? And moreover, our aim is not to just produce these results, but to build resources that the entire ecosystem of planners can use in India. And we are creating these open source, easily accessible data sets and bringing the planning best practices. A key building block is the weather and renewable data set, which we released today. And after that, we are also working on due diligence on load forecast and the impact of weather years on it. And hopefully we can share that later this year. So that brings me on how we are approaching power system modeling for this project. This slide shows the key steps, starting with the demand projections, then designing these least cost optimal portfolios, and finally testing whether those portfolio can meet reliability. A critical part of this approach is we are not just relying on a single typical weather year. Instead, we aim to run production cost models across many years and specifically focusing on correlated hourly load and renewable generation data as representative of as real conditions as could be on the ground. And moving beyond averages and testing multiple weather year, we can evaluate these portfolios for the ground, like how they perform in practice. So with that, let me summarize the key elements of the project. So first, one of our main contributions, which we are very excited to share today, these raw weather data sets and model-ready solar and wind inputs. And our colleagues from Vaisala and NREL will go shortly into more details about that. And second, we are developing these multiple demand scenarios, capturing not just the long-term patterns, but the impact of multiple weather years. And finally, stress testing them for reliability. And looking forward to engaging with you all as we progress in this journey. And with that, thank you a lot for listening today, and I'll hand it back to Priya.
Great, thank you so much, Sonika. Our next speaker is Dr. Justin Sharp. Justin, while I complete your introduction, I invite you to start sharing your screen. As Sonika described, a core component of the overall modeling framework is weather and renewable datasets. Dr. Sharp will speak to the importance of weather datasets and provide an overview of what constitutes robust datasets. He's an atmospheric scientist with 21 years of experience in the electric utility sector, applying meteorological knowledge to improve power system outcomes. He has worked for a system operator, a renewable IPP as an independent consultant, and now works for EPRI. Justin, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Priya, and it's an honor to be presenting here today. Thank you for everybody's interest. So as Priya said, I'm going to tee this up for the rollout of the data set that Dr. Stork is going to talk about next, and Sonika set it up very nicely for me going into this. So I'm going to talk about what weather data sets for power system modeling in general and in India specifically need to look like. I was involved in a fairly major project with the Energy Systems Integration Group in the last couple of years, where I led a team to produce a report that basically answered this question. And so this talk gives a very brief outline, and you can get a lot more information from that report. So first of all, I think it's worth looking at why weather data sets are so important. So we have this evolving energy weather nexus that Sonika kind of alluded to. This chart here is just a schematic that's intended to kind of show you how important weather is becoming. And so it starts at 2022 on the left and the right, on the left-hand side for demand and the right-hand side for generation, and converges at 2050 on the in the middle. And what I'm trying to show here is how on the demand side, we're beginning to electrify a lot of existing energy use, such as, for example, transportation and residential and commercial heating and cooling, etc., are all becoming electrified. That drives up the amount of weather impact. It also drives up the weather complexity, because now you've got things like essentially residences on wheels with regard to EVs and other electric transportation. Then on the generation side, really the complexity explodes. We're reducing the dispatchable fleet, and at the same time massively increasing the weather-driven fleet, particularly wind and solar. And as you do that, the complexity really increases, not just because you've got more weather-driven generation, but because that generation, the attributes of that generation vary very dramatically across time and space. And I'm going to show a little bit more about that in a moment. So the conclusions of the report that we produced for ESIG basically came out with these seven recommendations of what the main attributes of time series data for general power system modeling needs are. And I've highlighted in green 5 of those, which are the 5 that the data set that we're looking at right now does extremely well in addressing. It's always a fine balance between the overall cost of a data set and how well it can meet all the objectives. But anyway, the objectives in brief are that you need to be able to include all the necessary variables to be able to understand supply and demand. So those are, of course, temperature, wind, and solar, but there's other variables that do have impacts as well, although they're more secondary. The second thing is that ideally we'd want to cover multiple decades so that we can capture all of the natural variability that occurs within the atmospheric system. In this particular case, we're covering a decade, which is a very good start. And then the three really important characteristics are the data is coincident and physically consistent, it's validated, and it's documented well. So what I mean by coincident and physically consistent is that all of the variables are physically tied to one another in a way that corresponds to the laws of the atmosphere. So for instance, if I'm using a physical model that's based on numerical weather prediction, for instance, I'm using the actual equations of motion in the atmosphere and and then parameterizations that reflect things that are occurring in the atmosphere, and all the different variables are moving in a synchronized fashion. Whereas if I took data from some observations and then some data from satellites and some data from a model, those wouldn't be physically consistent, and I might end up with clouds that are not associated with the wind that I'm seeing, that's not associated with the temperature, for instance. So it's really important. It's also really important that they're chronological, because now we're having to deal with things like storage. And so it's not just important to get the distributions right, it's also important to get how those distributions evolve in time right. And then a really key thing is this validation aspect, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. We really must understand how well these data sets reflect actual conditions and quantify the uncertainty, because the results of the downstream modeling will be impacted by that. And there is a general tendency within the sector to just grab whatever data is available and use whatever's easiest to use. And that is a recipe for disaster. And so the validation is very important, as is the documentation, so that people can transparently understand what the limitations are and have some guidance for usage. I'm going to talk about availability and access next. Publicly available, expertly curated, easily accessible. These are all things that make a weather data set valuable. Without those things, you don't have the type of transparency that you need for these types of studies. And then lastly, periodically refreshed. Ideally, we want to update these data sets when the state of the art changes. So I will move on to the next slide and talk about the typical data sources that are used in power system modeling and why and when we would use synthetic data. So typically in the past, as Sonika mentioned, the relationship between weather and the power system was always there, but it was not as complex as it is now. And so we would typically use observations for modeling load and hydro. But today, as we're getting more and more wind and solar, we have these fields that vary really rapidly in time and space. And the observations, while always the best data to use if they were broadly available and available across very long timeframes, they're typically not available. So if you look at this picture on the right-hand side, it's from it's across the northwest of the United States, and it's from two identical models that are just configured in for an identical time, where the model is configured in a slightly different way. In one case, it's configured to have a grid point every 36 kilometers, and in the bottom case, it's every 4 kilometers. And you can see how that same model produces very, very different results and different structure, because it's able to resolve atmospheric features in the lower case that are not able to be resolved in the upper case. And this one is for solar. And so you can imagine when you're planning where solar plants go, or you're trying to do resource adequacy type studies or capacity expansion studies, you get very different results between these two data sets. Now, if you were just to have a few points, say 10 or 20 points across the domain, then you're not going to be able to correctly assess the variability in space at all, which is why we have to use synthetic data sets. You mentioned briefly about different sources. So sometimes the synthetic data sets are produced using models, typically numerical weather prediction models. Increasingly today, we're going to start seeing things coming from artificial intelligence models, AI weather prediction. And then we also see data sets that come from, that are derived from satellite, where the satellite retrieval data is used in a physical model to come up with information like GHI and DNI. So how are we doing today? And are today's data sets robust? Well, in the ESIG report, we put together a table that considered these attributes that I mentioned, the 7 attributes, and broke it down in a little bit more detail, and assigned a color to each one, where dark green is fully met and light green is close to being met, and then red is not met at all, with everything in between. And as you can see, there's not any one of these data sets that meets all of the requirements. ERA 5, for example, which is very commonly used, meets a lot of the requirements. It's very easy to use, But the problem is that its resolution is pretty low. It's about the same as that first picture I showed you a few moments ago. Another one is Wind Toolkit, which is used a lot, which was produced by NREL, and that has got the resolution, so it meets that requirement. But the problem is that it doesn't extend over many decades. So just as an example. So getting a little bit more into that notion of model space not being physical models, physical space, all models are always, they're never perfect. I mean, even observations are not perfect either, but model simulations are imperfect because it's not possible to model the atmosphere perfectly across at the fine enough resolution. But what this picture is showing you here is what the difference is between using, say, for instance, a 30-kilometer grid spacing, such as the data set which is commonly used, which is ERA 5, that's on the right-hand side, with modeling the same domain in the same time frame using a 1-kilometer resolution. And with that higher resolution, basically the model is able to see the complexity of the terrain and of the land use, and can start to build these structures and physical phenomena that can't be resolved in the lower resolution data. And they also wouldn't be able to be resolved in lower resolution observational data either, which is why this synthetic data is so valuable. The boxes here are some wind farms in this particular area, and you can see how dramatically different the wind field is across time and space through this area. But which one is the best? Now, the one on the left-hand side definitely looks more compelling, but is it actually better? And that's where the validation and uncertainty quantification comes in and becomes essential. And so one of the things that I did actually as part of a GridLab study was I looked at validation for the wind toolkit from NREL by comparing it with generation from Bonneville Power Administration. I normalized the generation from Bonneville because obviously more and more wind farms are being built all the time, more and more solar has been added. In this case, I was just looking at wind. And so I figured out what the wind generation would be with the amount of wind on the system in 2013. And then I used the wind toolkit, running it through a power curve to figure out how much wind generation I would get using the model simulation. What I found was this dramatic bias where the wintertime, the model data indicated I had far more wind potential than I did in reality. And in the summertime, I had less. And there's some really good physical reasons for this. And in the wintertime, it's basically associated with surface inversions that the model does a very poor job in handling. But the interesting thing with this is that the time when those inversions occur is the very time when we've got high loads. So you have a use case issue in that if you were looking to examine resource adequacy, the adequacy study would be using data that indicated you had more resource than you really did. So that's why validation is really important, so we can at least understand the biases, correct them if possible, and consider them in the downstream. On the right-hand side, I've got another use case example, which would be if we were doing wind integration. This is the ERA 5 data set, and you see these bright lines in the middle. What those are artifacts from the model that are associated with particular periods of data assimilation. I don't want to get into too much detail about them, but you can imagine if you have sudden jumps in wind speed, those create artificial power ramps, which change the ability to integrate power when you go on your downstream modeling. So what do we need to do? What are some of the low-hanging fruit associated with this validation and uncertainty quantification question? Well, as we build out this renewable energy network, and as Sonika just mentioned, it's been, renewable energy has been built out tremendously quickly in India. Every single one of those plants typically has meteorological observations that are dedicated to the plant, and in addition to that, every wind turbine actually has an anemometer on it, and that anemometer needs to work in order for the wind turbine to work. And so we're building out this amazing network of ground truth. But unfortunately, most of the owners of that network believe that their data has a lot of proprietary value, which it's kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. If you just have a jigsaw puzzle piece, you can't see the big picture. But if you put it all together, you really can see the big picture. And so the real key here going forward is that we start to understand that if we share this ground truth data, we can really elevate and raise all boats within the industry. I did mention here something about ERCOT, which is a system operator in the US. But basically what I'm saying here is that there are a few places where sharing is becoming required. And I think that's something that we need to do going forward in order to really get to the next level. And so I'll just wrap up quickly here by mentioning that user education and user knowledge is really important. These data sets are very complex, and we really need to have transdisciplinary cooperation between the different sectors. So the meteorologists and the power system people are working together to understand one another's needs, so that we don't push these uncertainties into the models blindly and not know what's going on downstream. And with that, I will thank you for your attention and pass it back to Priya.
Thank you very much, Justin. Our next speaker is Dr. Pascal Stork. Pascal, I invite you to share your screen as I complete your introduction. With that informative overview from Justin about what constitutes strong data sets, we are ready to learn about the specific weather data sets that are being released today due to the efforts of Dr. Stork from Vaisala and his team. Pascal has been working at the intersection of the weather and renewable energy industry for the past 25 years, specifically in the areas of resource assessment and energy forecasting. Pascal, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Priya. Can you see the screen okay?
Yes, it looks great.
Excellent, excellent. Well, it's my pleasure to be here. I think this release of this data set is a huge step in the right direction. As Justin said, no data sets are perfect, but we're just trying to move things forward, and this is definitely a step in that direction. But first, a little bit about Vaisala, and specifically the group that I work with, XWeather, a group inside of Vaisala. As we all know, we've talked about this right from the beginning, the weather is constantly changing. The weather this year in India is different than the weather last year. The weather changes from hour to hour, season to season, day to day. But inside of Vaisala XWeather, we believe that giving our customers weather intelligence and forecasting can turn the challenge of weather into an advantage. We work with some of the biggest companies in the world in all of these sectors that you see on the screen. But specific to the India renewable energy market, we've provided wind and solar weather data and energy services to the market for the last 15 years. I've probably met some of you in person. Okay, when we get specifically into renewable energy, it's really a tale of two technologies. We're talking specifically wind and we're talking specifically solar, and each of those is unique in its weather challenge. So part one, I'm going to talk about what we use and the tools we use to create the wind data. And that basically is the use of a numerical weather simulation or numerical weather prediction NWP modeling system. So what does that look like? What is numerical weather simulation? Well, numerical weather simulation is a piece of computer software, very complicated. It has all the things that some of you learned about in engineering school. There's thermodynamics, dynamics, et cetera, et cetera. All those equations are in there. And then it takes inputs that come from some of these coarse resolution data sets that Justin was talking about, like the ERA5. And he already talked about the limitations there. It's just too coarse. It's got a lot of information, but it just doesn't resolve what's going on at the land surface. Justin showed some excellent examples of the limitations of these coarse resolution data sets. But what if we could use ERA5 just as the starting condition? So let's take ERA5 at 30-kilometer resolution, and let's bring in all that high resolution topography. Let's bring in the mountains and the valleys. Let's bring in the coastlines and the oceans. Let's bring in the soil characteristics, and let's bring in the vegetation. And let's actually have a numerical weather simulation model running on a supercomputer, integrate that all together and just make it a lot better. Oh, and by the way, if we had observations like Justin was talking about, we could feed those into the simulation as well. But the beauty of this is we already have all the observations we need to take a first pass at this in the ERA5 dataset that we use as an input. So what do we get when we run these NWP models in the cloud using all these great inputs? Well, we get a full 4-dimensional simulation. The motion of the atmosphere is simulated, the thermodynamics of what's going on as water vapor is changing phases, cloud evolution, radiative transfer, all that stuff is basically fully resolved. And it's basically integrating forward in a second-by-second time step. So this takes a lot of computational resources to do, and it produces big data sets. We'll talk about that in just a second. So here's a little bit more of the details of what we did. So the domain, 5-kilometer resolution. So every dot you see there on the right-hand side, every one of those pixels is a 5-kilometer by 5-kilometer box. That's the representation of the terrain over India and the surrounding area. That extent of that colored box is the area that we simulated at 5-kilometer resolution. There's actually a nest outside of that that is at coarser resolution and coarser resolution to capture storm systems as they're crossing through the entire subcontinent and the entire sort of Central Asia region. Specifically, what did we do? We ran the WRF model 3.91. We like that model. It's stable. We've been using it for a really long time for modeling wind farms in India. We're very comfortable with it. The boundary conditions is the input. As Justin had already said, ERA5 is a great starting point. We believe in that data set. We use it as the input here. It's a 10-year-long simulation. It starts just before January 1, 2014, and it ends just after December 31st, 2024. Horizontal resolution was 5 kilometers. The average time step, like every time the model actually stops to think about what's going on, is every 30 seconds. So there's a lot of time steps in this model simulation, a lot of equations to solve. And then we record the output every 15 minutes. Right, so this is a 10-year simulation, and it required 260 individual simulations. Why that's important, I'll get to in a second. Each simulation was 15 days long. We had about 24 hours of spin up to let the atmosphere kind of adjust to all of a sudden having the mountains and everything in there. And then we threw away the first 24 hours, and then we saved 2 weeks of output. Now, why wouldn't you just run a 10-year continuous simulation? Well, that's a really bad idea for a number of reasons. It would take way too long. The model might crash. You'd have to restart it. That's just not the way it's done. It's all about parallelizing it. You break it down into 14, 15-day chunks. You can run all the chunks at the same time. And instead of having to wait 2 years for your data set, you can basically have this entire data set done in about a month or two in an Amazon computing environment. This, however, creates a problem of temporal seams. One model simulation begins, it ends, the next one begins, it ends. There may be a gap there, there might be a seam. So we aligned those temporal seams at what we would figure to be a quiet time in the India market, about 4:30 in the morning. It's not exactly perfectly quiet, but that's as good a point as any in the India day to actually have one of these temporal seams. Okay, so what's available to you? A lot, like 20 terabytes worth of data, all these variables. So over the domain you see on the right, every 15 minutes for 10 years on a 5-kilometer by 5-kilometer grid, you get what's most important for wind energy, which is multiple heights above the ground, wind speed, wind direction, air temperature, and air density at model levels from 28 to 500 meters, and important for the wind energy industry, interpolated levels to the hub heights that matter, 80 meters, 100 meters, 120 meters, and 140 meters. There's a lot of vertical structure in this data set that's important for the wind energy industry. We also save a lot of other weather variables. We call these sort of diagnostic variables. They're important for things like load, but they're also important for when we do validation and we see that, oh, we think there's a little bit of bias with the wind speed. Well, what's causing that bias? Is that bias related to the long wave radiation? Like when it's a really clear night, we see something with the boundary layer, and that could be used as a diagnostic variable for doing some statistics to improve the model performance statistically after the fact. We're making all this data available. I look forward to your feedback. Okay, so here I'm going to just show a 3-day snapshot animation. So this is the 5-kilometer by 5-kilometer domain over all of India. It's a 3-day snapshot animation. Every 15 minutes is being shown. So you see the wind is ebbing and flowing throughout India. The brighter colors are higher wind speeds, the lower colors are lower wind speeds. You see the cyclone beginning to ramp up in the Bay of Bengal. You see the high winds in the Himalaya mountain range. You see the wind basically pulsing through all of the valleys in India. You see sort of the exit jets as the wind is coming, out of the west coast of India into the ocean. This is a phenomenally big data set, 20 terabytes worth of data, and it's going to be released into the public domain. And we'll talk a little bit later about how you can get access to it. Next slide. So one thing, that was a nice movie. You can also drill into a point. So I wanted to show an example. Now we go to one location, one 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer pixel in the south of India. Let's pull out the wind speed at 100 meters above the ground every 15 minutes for 10 years, and let's take a look at it. And this is exactly what we were talking about before. You look at this and you're like, what's a typical meteorological year? What's the average condition? There's no such thing. Every year is different. There's obviously a monsoon season and a lean season, but every year the monsoon season looks different. It has a different strength, it has a different length. Sometimes it's strong, sometimes it's weak, sometimes there's more wind in the off season. Everything's changing all the time. You now have access to all 10 years of data like this for all these pixels in India for the wind side of things. We did a light validation. We looked at 10 locations. We saw that on average at those 10 locations, the observed wind speed at hub height was about 5.5 meters per second on average. The modeled wind speed was about 5.6 meters per second on average. We like to look at the uncertainty of that, looking at the standard deviation of the differences. So this is a data set that I would say the uncertainty is plus or minus 9%. We heard about that statistic before. That doesn't mean it's always plus or minus 9%. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. More importantly, we also like to look at the ability of the modeled wind speed to explain the power production of a wind farm, because that's more of a matching of scale. These are 5 kilometer pixels. It's kind of difficult to compare them to a met mast. It's easier to compare them to an entire wind farm. And there we see that the ability of the modeled wind speed to explain the monthly power was almost as good as having an on-site met mast. The on-site met mast versus power production had R-squareds of about 0.89. The model data versus power production, not as good, but about 0.86. A big step forward in the ability to model power systems at scale. So back to a tale of two technologies. Now we switch to solar. So these numerical weather simulation models, oh man, are they really fun to look at. They run on supercomputers. They solve all the thermodynamics of the atmosphere, but they don't really do a good job with clouds. There's a lot of atmospheric scientists around the world that are working to make the numerical weather simulation models better for being able to simulate clouds. But you know what's really good at clouds? Satellite images. So this is a satellite image from yesterday showing where the clouds are in India. We have access to these satellite images every 5 minutes for the last 10 years, even further than that, for the entire world. And we take these satellite images, we combine them with elevation data, we combine them with aerosol data, water vapor data, all this other stuff that affects how much pollution in the atmosphere and how much radiation can hit the surface. We bring all this raw data together, and then we have a cloud index algorithm that says, given how bright this pixel is, how much clouds do we think is actually there? We have another algorithm, which is the clear sky algorithm, that says, given how much pollution is in the air, what do we think the clear sky conditions would be without the clouds? Then we smash those two together to estimate the global horizontal irradiance, the irradiance that's reaching the surface on a horizontal plane. And then we split that into its components, the direct normal irradiance and the diffuse irradiance. All three of those components are important for modeling solar panels, which are generally tilted and sometimes follow the tracking of the sun. So you need to know what's coming from the whole sky, what's coming directly from the sun, all three of these components. So what's available in the solar data set? Well, we actually took our solar data set, which is from satellite images, so it's a different grid resolution and it's a different temporal resolution than the NWP. And we said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to reproject the whole thing. So it's on exactly the same grid and exactly the same time steps as the wind data set, so that the people that are using it downstream, it just lines up. Right, so you get every 15 minutes, 10 years, 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer grid. get all these solar variables from the Vaisala algorithms, the ones that are really important for solar system modeling, like GHI, DNI diffuse, and the clear sky index. And then also other weather variables that come from ERA 5. Well, we just talked about ERA 5. Why are you giving me ERA 5? Well, it's useful for doing diagnostic downstreams for understanding if things aren't lining up or we're seeing things that are interesting. What did ERA 5 think the GHI was compared to what did the satellite data set think the GHI was? What does the wind speed from the NWP look like compared to the wind speed from ERA 5? It's always nice to have a frame of reference to sort of line things up. So we can do the same thing we did for wind. Let's look at one location. This is actually Gurgaon near New Delhi in the north of India. Let's pull every 15 minutes for the last 10 years, right? And let's take a look at it. First thing you see here, at least, to my eye, it's like, doesn't really seem like a lot of year-to-year variability. The shape seems about the same every single year. I see that there's definitely a peak in the sunny season in April and May when things are really, really hot. Then the monsoon comes in and there's a little less irradiance. But we definitely notice that there's less variability in the irradiance on average from one year to the next, but it certainly is not zero. And there certainly is a lot of variability from day to day and from month to month as well. Some people will use ERA 5 as the solar data. ERA 5 was never meant to be a solar data set. It really doesn't do a good job with clouds, and that shows in the verification statistics. So here we did a light validation where we looked at our satellite data that we're providing here to this project versus ERA 5. Our global experience is that the satellite-derived data has an error that's about 40% less than ERA 5. It's got much better correlations. This is the Gurgaon site, the BSRN site in northern India. And again, we see here the Vaisala data set on the left-hand side, the ERA 5 data set on the right-hand side. Hourly is on the top, daily is on the bottom. The Vaisala data that we're putting into this project is just simply much better. This fits with our global experience. It's also true in India. So now what? Well, the data are available. Have at it. This is 20 terabytes worth of data. What could you do? You can do anything you want. Here's an example. I took the wind site and the solar site. Wind sites in the south of India, solar sites in the north of India. What if you want to look at the hourly correlation between wind and solar? What about the daily correlation, monthly correlation, annual correlation? What's the probability of having a good year for solar when there's a bad year of wind at this location, that location, or any location, right? So this is what we're talking about. But really what we want to know is we want all of this cast in terms of energy. And we want to understand it at times that matter to the grid, like low hydro. And we want to understand it at the scale that matters to the grid. And that takes us to our next presentation.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pascal. Our next speaker is Pratik Joshi from NREL. Pratik, can you please begin to share your screen while I complete your introduction? If it was not quite clear, it is worth noting that the data sets developed by Vaisala are incredibly valuable, but they are also incredibly voluminous, totaling 20 terabytes of data. They're not quite ready in their raw format to be directly ingested by power system models. So now I invite Pratik Joshi, who is a researcher at NREL, focused on power sector modeling and analysis, to describe the processed weather data sets that are being released today, which represent a significant step towards making this rich and granular raw weather data set amenable for direct use by modelers and researchers. Pratik, you may begin.
Sounds great. Thanks, Priya, for the introduction, and thanks to others for their previous presentations. And get started. So Pascal already spoke about the weather data that Vaisala generated. So I'll take that baton and spend the bulk of this presentation discussing how we used that weather data to calculate renewable energy capacity, generation, and cost estimates using our renewable energy potential, or REV model, as you'll see it referred to in the slides. And though the focus today is on the processed renewable energy data sets, I did want to note how this data can be used in downstream modeling efforts, including in this project. So we take the processed wind and solar data sets and we use them as an input into capacity expansion or long-term planning models, such as the REITs India model. And these types of tools help us assess the optimal mix of generation, transmission, storage assets to meet our future power sector goals under different reliability constraints over multi-year time horizon. And then we can also use this data in various production cost modeling tools, and those allow for more detailed hourly analysis on how load is met and how resources are dispatched, focusing on a single year at a time. And we developed technology assumptions based on input from various stakeholders in India, including our partners at Tata Power. So for solar, we consider both utility scale ground mount PV and distributed rooftop PV. For both technologies, we assume a fixed tilt with the angle equal to the latitude of the data point. Those data points are at that 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer resolution that Pascal mentioned for the weather data. We also assume a DC to AC ratio of 1.4, an inverter efficiency of 98%, and total system losses of 18%. For wind, we consider both onshore wind and offshore wind. And for offshore wind, we also consider fixed bottom and floating turbines based on the water depth. Floating if the water depth is greater than 60 meters. So here I've just listed the hub heights, the rotor diameters, and the turbine capacities. And I'll also note we'll be sharing all these slides after the webinar, so you can have these for reference. And now I'll discuss how we go from that weather data actually to the renewable energy production and cost data using those assumptions. So here we have the weather data again from Vaisala, that large 20 terabyte data set. And then we use the hourly weather data and those technology assumptions that I showed a couple slides ago on wind and solar to calculate the hourly energy generation of a wind or a solar plant at each of those locations, at each of those 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer grid cells. We then use assumptions on technology capital and operations and maintenance costs to calculate the site-based levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE. And that site-based LCOE does not account for transmission interconnection costs. But of course, we know that it's not possible to build a wind and solar plant at every single data point for which we have weather data. And so we apply some exclusions for each technology. For instance, removing protected environmental areas, inland water bodies, mountainous areas, for instance. So that narrows down our subset of data for where we could theoretically build a new wind and solar. And once we have those remaining data points that we consider for development, we overlay data on the bulk transmission grid. This helps us calculate interconnection costs based on the distance to the nearest transmission line or substation. And that allows us to estimate total LCOE, accounting for interconnection costs. So we end up with supply curves. This is that supply curve module. Supply curves, and we share data on that, and I'll talk about that in a few slides, but those really communicate how much wind and how much solar and megawatts or gigawatts can be built in different regions at certain levelized costs. So it's just helpful to get an estimate, a relative estimate of where are resources more cost effective to develop. And then finally, we provide data on representative hourly generation profiles for each of the 147 resource regions that we consider in India. So it's shown in this map here. It's a little bit small, but can expand that later. So as noted, the weather data is at that approximately 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer resolution. The representative profile for each of those regions is selected from all possible profiles in that region. Could be hundreds. But the representative profile best represents the average variability of wind or solar resources within that region. It's just important to note that it's not an average profile. Just taking an average would artificially smooth out some of the natural variability. So happy to provide more details on this methodology offline, or feel free to drop any questions in the Q&A box. And I can also take a look at those if anyone's interested. Okay, now for the fun part, the actual processed RE renewable energy data sets that we're making available for utility PV, distributed PV, onshore wind, and offshore wind. And so we have three main categories. First is these regional summary CSV files. These provide the technical potential capacity of each technology and the average capacity factor in each region and for each weather year. We also provide these hourly profile CSV files. That's the hourly capacity factor values over an entire year. So for each weather year. And it's the profile that is most representative. Again, I'm using that term representative, which is what I discussed in the previous slide. And then finally, we have supply curve CSV files. So supply curve files, they provide that technical potential capacity information and the average levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE. And we're also working with our partners at Tata Power to validate this data for specific sites. And then I'll end this segment by just showing a few high-level results and visualizations. This map is showing the 10-year average capacity factor for utility scale solar PV in each of those subregions. So that's in the map here, all years averaged, and then this bar chart is showing the variation in average capacity factor across different years. Just note the y-axis scale, so these average capacity factors go from between 16 and 17%. So not actually that much variability when averaged across weather years. But of course, we drill down into that hourly data, which is most important for the detailed power sector modeling. So I have a similar figure here for distributed solar PV, rooftop PV. The methodology on which regions were considered is a little bit different for distributed PV to keep our modeling computationally feasible. We just considered metropolitan areas with a population greater than 1 million, and that methodology is further outlined in this report that I linked to in the slides. So you can take a look at that for more details. And then here's the same map and chart for capacity factors, but for offshore wind. And again, the y-axis here is important. The average capacity factors are ranging from 20 to 22%. So again, not as big of a difference as it seems, just based on this chart. Again, we're more interested in drilling down and not just looking at annual averages, although those are very helpful for just visualizing the data. So on the slides here, we are just highlighting example wind generation profiles for Madhya Pradesh on this slide, and then Rajasthan for this slide. Going back to the MP one, the y-axis here corresponds to the capacity factor, and the x-axis represents hour of day averages for each month. So they look a little smoother than they would if you just plotted the hourly capacity factor values for an entire year for specific locations. So each of these boxes represents a weather year. The gray lines here are the same in all boxes. They represent all years 2015 to 2024. And then we're just highlighting in red the particular profile for that year. So this is just helpful for visualization purposes. We're making all these visualizations available as well. But for the capacity expansion and production cost modeling, we're really drilling down on that hourly data. Okay. So same figure for Rajasthan, and then here's a high-level snapshot of the offshore wind data, obviously with just the coastal regions considered. General observations to round things out are that wind tends to have higher generation during the monsoon months, and nighttime solar has higher generation, of course, during the daytime, but also during the non-monsoon months. So we show that with with these heat maps for Rajasthan, just called out here. And because of their relative availability, they actually complement each other very nicely. And variation within a day, or diurnal variation, as you can imagine, is more important for solar. We can see that in the heat map with darker colors, the higher generation, of course, during the middle of the day, and less variation across months of the year, but still slightly darker on those non-monsoon months. And then for wind, seasonal variation is more important. Showed that in those bar charts a couple slides ago, and also in this heat map. The darker colors, the higher generation, tend to be in the monsoon months and at night. So this is a lot of data to digest all at once. We had to go through it relatively quickly given the time constraints of this webinar. But if you're interested in diving deeper into the raw or processed data sets and visualizing them, you can take those CSV files, put them into whatever tool you like to use, Python, R, whatever you want to make custom visualizations. We'll also make some of the plots that we've already made and those figures available for downloading. And then finally, we are making available a QGIS file that all users can open up and toggle layers on and off to visualize some of the data overlaid on a map of India. So that's what I'm showing here. These are the same figures that you have seen in the slides. So I'll just toggle on, like, for instance, I guess this is not quite working very well. But yeah, basically we have this QGIS file available, and QGIS is a free geospatial software, so anyone can download it from free. And then if you just open up this file, this will pre-populate, and then you can toggle on these tabs to view the data. So feel free to reach out with any further questions. I think we'll be making our emails available as well. And I will pass it back over to our moderator, Sonika.
Thank you, Prateek. This is fantastic. Well, this is what I'm sure a lot of you have been waiting for, where our data is actually living. So at this stage, I would love to show you the website where this data can be accessed. The website is gridlab.org/India_weather data. And we will also paste it in the Zoom chat. And I would like to just walk you through the web page very briefly. Just give me a moment so that I can share my screen. So on this website, what you'll see are summary descriptions of both the raw data as well as the processed data sets, as well as more detailed descriptions below, which are available on these tabs here, which can be clicked, as well as instructions about how you can access the data sets. So what happens when you click on this link on this tab here, links for data sets, you will see this very short survey. Whoops, and I think I accidentally unshared my screen. So just give me one more moment. There we go. So on the screen, you'll see this very short survey. You fill it out. Once you click submit, then it will take you to the screen here. And let me just make sure I'm sharing. what I want you to see. Okay, that is correct. So you can click on these links. The top one is the sample raw weather data sets. It's not 20 terabytes, but it's 80 gigabytes. So it's still not super fast to download, but it's certainly manageable to download. So that lives here. You also have the URI for all 20 terabytes of the data, the raw weather data that lives on the Amazon Web Services portal. And the URI is listed here. And that is how you use, that is how you would access the raw weather data sets. And then finally, there's a link for the process weather data sets, renewable data sets that Pratik just described. And those are very manageable download at 3 gigabytes. And this is the drive that you would see at this when you click on that link. So with that, we are ready to just about conclude the formal portion of this webinar. In case you do have follow-up questions, we will paste our emails in the Zoom chat. Just give me a moment and I'll be able to do that. And in addition, we will be augmenting the webpage with a question and answer document in the coming weeks. Before we transition, I would like to emphasize that this effort is a contribution towards addressing the weather data set needs, but certainly does not represent a completion to the task at hand, but hopefully it is still helpful towards everybody's needs.